Nick Gravenites had a cruel curse. He wrote music to celebrate life, but death came to collect it. He wrote Buried Alive in the Blues. He wrote it for Janis Joplin as a playful ode to the artist's life, but Janis never got to sing it. She died the night before recording, turning Nick's playful song into a wordless obituary. This is the tragedy of Nick Gravenites, a lost Greek man who gave his heart and soul to the greatest legends of the 60s. He gave them melody, he gave them lyrics, he gave them a reason to burn out. And in the end, he was the only one left to clean up the ashes. He was no hero. He was the greatest eulogist in the history of rock and roll. The man condemned to live on listening to the silence of his friends who died because of the music he created. That long, dark shadow stretches back to a single point of light, flickering precariously amidst the dust and glory of Chicago's South Side. October 2nd, 1938, Chicago, Illinois. The day Nicholas George Gravenites cried his first tears, Chicago wasn't the sleek, gleaming skyscrapers we know today. It was a city of steel and dust, blood and sweat. Cattle screamed incessantly from the slaughterhouses, and black smoke billowed from the steel mill chimneys, staining the sky gray. It was a harsh, ruthless, and utterly divided world. His parents were immigrants from Paleokori, a harsh region of Greece and Arcadia. They fled poverty in their homeland to the land of opportunity, America, but they arrived in another isolated island called Brighton Park. Nick would later describe it with brutal honesty as a white ethnic ghetto. It wasn't just a poor neighborhood. It was a fortress where Poles, Irish, Italians, and Greeks hunkered down in barbed wire fenced sections, shielded by their languages, religions, and prejudices. Their identity wasn't a matter of choice, but of survival. Your street name, your last name, your church, it was a badge of distinction, distinguishing friend from foe. Nick's family was devoutly Greek Orthodox. Inside the house, English was spoken with a hint of ancient Greek. The smell of olive oil wafted through the air, and a strict patriarchal code hung in the air. To young Nick, this tradition felt less like a source of pride and more like a suffocating shackle. Born in America, he was never fully accepted as an American. He was Greek, yet had never seen Greece. He was a child on the edge. But the rift that shook his life to its core, the foundation of his soul, came all too early. In 1949, when Nick was just 11, his father, the pillar of his family and the unwavering authority, passed away. In the psychology of blues, a wound is the starting point of everything. It was a primal moment of loss, when the membrane enveloping a child's universe was torn and the cold winds of the world burst through the cracks. For Nick, his father's death was more than just a sorrow. It was a signal of derailment. With his father gone, the discipline that had suppressed him, the fence that had protected him, vanished. All that remained was poverty, anxiety, and a vast rage that knew no outlet. The harsh venom of the Chicago streets began to seep into the hole in the 11-year-old's heart. He refused to be the good immigrant son. Instead, he learned to use his fists. In the narrow alleys of Brighton Park, he fought to survive, or simply to vent his inner rage. He became a bully, a troublemaker, and a source of tears for his mother. His mother and relatives, trying to straighten out Nick's uncontrollable behavior, sent him to St. John's Military Academy, a factory where uniforms, discipline, orders, and obedience would break the wildness in boys and mold them into soldiers. But they didn't know Nick Gravenites. Instead of subduing him, the repression only made him a more resilient and rebellious man. Instead of following orders, he asked questions. Instead of standing in line, he broke ranks. Eventually, he was kicked out of there too, for fighting. His fists always spoke louder than his words, and his eyes held a twisted, mocking glare at the world. So in the mid-1950s, Nick returned to the streets of Chicago. But he was no longer a simple street thug. He had grown into a strange young man, angry at everything in the world, yet simultaneously thirsty for intellectual knowledge. In 1956, he enrolled at the University of Chicago. This was one of the most ironic moments of his life. By day, he mingled with the sons of doctors and lawyers, the elite who discussed philosophy and classics, discussing Aristotle and Plato. But at night, he was sucked into a completely different world. The city of Chicago was divided by an invisible, high-voltage electric fence. The north side was the white world, the south side, the black world. In 1950 Chicago, for a white young man, not even one of the mainstream Anglo-Saxon whites, but a peculiarly Greek one, to hang out late at night in a South Side club wasn't simply a matter of deviance. It was a life-or-death gamble. Racial discrimination was the air before it was the law, and a white man entering a black neighborhood was like a straggler, dropped in enemy territory with no police protection. But Nick Gravenites wasn't there out of curiosity like a tourist. He wasn't carrying a notepad like a researcher. He crossed that dangerous border like someone searching for home to satisfy a visceral hunger. What drew him there was sound carried by the wind, a harmonica howling through a cheap amplifier, a bass pounding like a heartbeat, and a raspy voice like a wild animal's howl. It was Muddy Waters. It was Howlin' Wolf. When he first opened the door to the 708 Club, or Pepper's Lounge, he was greeted by a thick layer of cigarette smoke, the pungent smell of sweat, and dozens of suspicious glances directed at him as a white stranger. But Nick didn't flinch. He was large, had a fierce appearance, and above all, his eyes bore the same kind of darkness as the black workers there. It was the gaze of the marginalized, the rage of the downtrodden. What he witnessed there wasn't just a musical performance. It was more like a religious ritual. On stage stood black people who had been exploited, toiling like animals in steel mills and slaughterhouses during the day. But the moment they picked up their guitars and stood before the microphone, they were no longer slaves. They were kings. When Muddy Waters scraped the strings with his slide bar fingers, the sharp sound cut into Nick's bones more sharply than a Chicago winter wind. As Howlin' Wolf crawled and roared across the stage, Nick found the language he'd been searching for his entire life. At the time, the music popular in mainstream America was either sweet, soft pop, or the demure folk songs sung by college students strumming their acoustic guitars. These songs sang of flowers and mountains, love and peace. Nick Gravenites despised such music. Having grown up fighting in the alleys of Brighton Park, such songs sounded like hypocrisy. He needed music that splattered blood and guts, music that stared the pain of reality in the face and growled. The blues had no pretense. It wasn't music that whined, "I'm sad." It was music that declared, "I'm in hell, but you can't kill me." It wasn't about transforming suffering into art, but about honing it into a weapon. Nick wanted to acquire that weapon. He spent more time in Southside clubs than in school classrooms. He became a regular. Black musicians were initially wary of him, but they soon realized this hulking Greek youth wasn't just some rich kid out to watch. He wasn't there to steal music, but to dedicate himself to it. They called him Nick the Greek, a term both derogatory and endearing. Roaming the streets of Chicago at night, a pistol in his pocket and a guitar in his hand, Nick was becoming more bluesy than anyone else. And it was on the edge of this dark and dangerous world that Nick met another white youth with a similar air. Born to a Jewish family on Chicago's north side, he was Mike Bloomfield. Bloomfield was a guitar prodigy. He played with a nervous, explosive energy that seemed to snap strings. Nick's dark charisma and Bloomfield's sharp, sensitive genius, the two men recognized each other like the north and south poles of a magnet. They were a coalition of outsiders, white people fascinated by the world of black people, second-generation immigrants who felt left out of mainstream society. They weren't simply trying to imitate black people performing white blues. They wanted to use the blues as a medium to tell their stories, to vent the anger of their youth struggling to survive in the cold city of Chicago. They wanted to be heirs, not imitators. As Nick played guitar and sang, he slowly began to realize that he could be a creator, not a mere observer. But he didn't know until then how dearly this music he had come to love, this wild and captivating world, would one day exact from him. The Southside clubs were hot, but within that fervor, the seeds of destruction were growing: alcohol, drugs, violence, and premature deaths. Nick had just bought his ticket and stepped into that dangerous amusement park. They were the Chicago White Boys, a label that carried both derision and grudging respect. The Black Masters, Muddy Waters, Otis Rush, Magic Sam watched them with hawk-like eyes. They had seen white tourists before. They had seen thieves come to steal riffs and leave. But these boys kept coming back. They sat in the front row night after night, soaking in the lessons. They bought the drinks. They learned the code. There is a famous story, often retold but vital to this narrative, of the night Muddy Waters, the King of Kings, finally anointed them. He didn't do it with a crown. He did it by letting them sit in. When Paul Butterfield blew his harp, creating a sound so thick and distorted it sounded like a saxophone played through a jet engine, Muddy smiled. It was the smile of a father watching a wayward son finally learn to walk. It was an acknowledgement that the blues was not a matter of skin color, but a matter of the soul's capacity for suffering and survival. Nick Gravenites was the chronicler of this transition. While Butterfield and Bloomfield were the virtuosos, Nick was the conceptualist. He understood that they couldn't just play covers of old Muddy Waters songs forever. That would be mimicry, a minstrel show in reverse. To be real, they had to write their own blues. They had to sing about their reality. And their reality was born in Chicago. When the Paul Butterfield Blues Band eventually formed, a mixed-race, high-voltage unit that included the rhythm section of Sam Lay and Jerome Arnold from Howlin' Wolf's band, it was a declaration of war on the folk music establishment. The early 1960s marked the peak of the folk scare. The college campuses were full of earnest young men in cardigans singing, "Michael, row the boat ashore." They viewed the blues as a pristine acoustic folk art, something to be studied in a museum. They wanted their bluesmen to be old, poor, and playing acoustic guitars on a porch in Mississippi. Nick Gravenites and his crew spat on that idea. They knew the blues wasn't about acoustic purity. It was about electricity. It was about volume. It was about the sound of the city. When the Paul Butterfield Blues Band plugged in, they played at a volume that physically hurt. They were aggressive. They were dangerous. And the song that led the charge was Nick's Born in Chicago. The song didn't apologize. It didn't ask for sympathy. It celebrated the grim toughness of the city. Rules are all right if there's someone left to play the game. It was a noir novel condensed into 3 minutes of adrenaline. For the white audience, this was a shock to the system. This wasn't the safe, sanitized blues of the folk revival. This was music that sounded like a mugging. Nick became the bad boy of the scene, a reputation he cultivated with a certain dark glee. He was the guy who knew where the bodies were buried, sometimes metaphorically, sometimes perhaps not. He moved through the underworld, of the Chicago club scene with a comfort that unnerved the suburban tourists. He was dealing with the club owners, the gangsters, the hustlers. He was absorbing the business of the blues, the dirty, exploitative machinery that ground artists into dust. During these years, 1963 to 1965, Nick was everywhere, yet nowhere. He wasn't the front man of the Butterfield Band. He was the shadow behind it. He was writing songs, jamming in the rehearsals, drinking with the band until dawn. But he often stood on the side of the stage while the flashbulbs popped. This was the beginning of his pattern, the man behind the curtain. He watched as Paul Butterfield became a sex symbol, a brooding icon of cool. He watched as Mike Bloomfield was hailed as the new American guitar god. He felt a mixture of pride and cynicism. He knew these men. He knew their demons. He knew that Bloomfield's frantic playing was a race against his own crushing insomnia and anxiety. He knew that Butterfield's tough exterior was a callus built over a deep sensitivity. Nick was the grounded one, the big Greek with the street smarts, the one who made sure the bills got paid and the dealers didn't rip them off. He was the designated survivor even then. The climax of this Chicago era came not in the city itself, but on the grassy fields of Newport, Rhode Island, in July 1965. The Newport Folk Festival was the Vatican of the folk movement, a holy place where acoustic purity was worshipped. And into this temple marched the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, with Nick Gravenites in their orbit. They were loud, they were rude, they were undeniably powerful. And they were the band that backed Bob Dylan when he made the most controversial decision in music history, to go electric. Nick was there, witnessing the cultural tectonic plates shift. He saw the folkies booing. He saw Pete Seeger, the high priest of folk, reportedly trying to cut the power cables with an axe. Nick looked at the chaos and likely smiled. He knew what they didn't. The future belonged to the electricity. The quiet acoustic past was dead. The noise of the city had won. But victory in the music business is a poisonous chalice. As the Butterfield Band exploded into national fame, the cracks in the foundation began to widen. The pressure was immense. The Chicago sound was now a commodity, something to be packaged and sold. The record executives descended like vultures. And with the fame came the drugs. In the clubs of the South Side, heroin was a reality, a tragic part of the landscape. But as the scene moved to the universities and the concert halls, drugs transformed from a coping mechanism into a lifestyle. Nick watched as the high became the goal. He dabbled, certainly. He was no saint, but he possessed a survival instinct that his friends seemed to lack. He saw the way Bloomfield's eyes would glaze over, the way he would disappear for days. He saw the edge of the cliff, and while his friends were dancing on it, Nick was checking the drop. By 1966, Chicago began to feel too small. The city that had birthed them was now suffocating them. The winters were too long, the violence too familiar. The center of gravity in the counterculture was shifting west. The summer of love was approaching, and San Francisco was calling. It promised a new kind of freedom, a psychedelic utopia where the rules of the old world didn't apply. For Mike Bloomfield, the move was an escape from the pressure of being a guitar god. For Nick Gravenites, it was a new frontier. He packed his bags, leaving behind the white ethnic ghetto, the memories of his father, and the ghost-filled clubs of the South Side. He took with him his guitar, his notebook, and the hardened, cynical wisdom of a Chicago street survivor. He was heading to the land of flower power, but he wasn't bringing flowers. He was bringing the blues. He was bringing the darkness. The wind was at his back, pushing him toward the Pacific edge, but Nick couldn't shake the feeling that he was fleeing a crime scene. The Chicago chapter was closing, but the bill for the lifestyle they had chosen was yet to be paid. and the collection agency was waiting in California. The city's iron gateway didn't look like a gateway to paradise when Nick Gravenites arrived. It looked like the jaws of a trap, painted international orange to hide the rust. He arrived in San Francisco in the mid-60s, carrying the heavy, industrial baggage of Chicago in his trunk. He was stepping out of a black and white noir film and into a technicolor hallucination. The city by the bay was vibrating. It was the eve of the summer of love, a moment that history has airbrushed into a montage of flower crowns, free love, and psychedelic awakening. But Nick Gravenites wasn't a flower child. He was a weed that had grown through the cracks of the Brighton Park pavement. He didn't come to California to tune in, turn on, and drop out. He came to work. The friction and the eventual fire that Nick Gravenites created in San Francisco was born of the sheer cultural dissonance of his arrival. The Haight-Ashbury scene was soft. It was built on the utopian dreams of middle-class kids who had read too much poetry and taken too much LSD. They believed that music could stop wars. They believed that love was all you needed. Nick knew better. Where he came from, love was nice, but a switchblade was reliable. He looked at the hippies with the skepticism of a man who had seen the bottom of a whiskey bottle in a South Side dive bar. He saw the naivety, but he also saw the opportunity. The San Francisco sound, that noodling, jamming acid rock sound defined by the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane, was missing something. It lacked a spine. It lacked the punch in the gut that the blues provided. It was airy, floating up toward the clouds. Nick Gravenites brought the gravity. He brought the anchor. And he wasn't the only exile from the Windy City. Mike Bloomfield had also made the pilgrimage. Bloomfield, the neurotic, brilliant guitar god, was running away from the expectations of being the new Clapton. He wanted to build something new, something that had never been heard before. He called Nick. "I want to start a band," Bloomfield said. But not just a blues band. He wanted an American music band. A band that could play everything: soul, R&B, jazz, rock, blues, gospel. A band with a horn section that could knock a wall down. A band with a rhythm section that swung like a wrecking ball. They called it the Electric Flag. If the Paul Butterfield Blues Band was a tank, heavy, armored, and relentless, the Electric Flag was a luxury liner rigged with explosives. It was ambitious, expensive, and doomed from the very first note. Nick was the front man. This was a shift. In Chicago, he had often been the shadow, the writer, the guy on the side. Now he was center stage. He was the voice. And what a voice it was. It wasn't the pretty, melodic croon of the folk singers. It was a gravel road baritone, weary and cynical, perfect for the songs of heartbreak and political disillusionment they were writing. They assembled a lineup that reads like a fantasy draft of 1960s musicians. On drums, they had Buddy Miles, a powerhouse who played with the subtlety of an artillery barrage. On bass, Harvey Brooks, who had played with Dylan. On keyboards, Barry Goldberg. And leading the charge, Mike Bloomfield, playing with a fire that seemed to be consuming him from the inside out. Their debut at the Monterey Pop Festival in June 1967 is the stuff of legend, often overshadowed by Hendrix burning his guitar or The Who smashing their equipment. But for the musicians in the crowd, the Electric Flag was the revelation. They were terrifyingly good. They played Groovin' Is Easy and Wine, songs that Nick had penned or arranged. They brought the house down. For a brief, shimmering moment in the summer of '67, Nick Gravenites was at the absolute apex of the counterculture. He was leading the hottest band in America. He was the bridge between the grit of the past and the psychedelic future. But the rot set in immediately. The Electric Flag was built on a foundation of heroin. In Chicago, heroin had been a grim reality of the jazz and blues scene, a dark secret kept in the back rooms. In San Francisco, among the elite musicians, it became an epidemic. It was the cool drug, the drug of the jazz masters like Charlie Parker, the drug that supposedly detached you from the pain of the world and let you focus purely on the music. It was a lie, of course, a lie that Nick watched swallow his friends whole. Mike Bloomfield was the first casualty of his own success. He was a man tortured by a chronic, debilitating insomnia. He simply couldn't sleep. His mind was a racing engine that wouldn't shut off. Heroin became his off switch. It was the only thing that gave him peace, but the peace was a coma. Nick watched as his friend, the most brilliant guitarist of his generation, began to fade. Bloomfield would show up to rehearsals late or not at all. He would nod off in the middle of a conversation. The fire in his playing began to flicker. Then there was the ego. Buddy Miles, the drummer, decided he wanted to be the star. He wanted to sing. He wanted to lead. The band became a battlefield. The American music band turned into a civil war. Nick Gravenites, the survivor, the man who had learned in the military academy and the streets of Chicago when to fight and when to retreat, looked at the situation with a cold, clear eye. He saw the writing on the wall. The album they released, A Long Time Comin', was a masterpiece. It fused soul, rock, and blues in a way that had never been done before. It should have been the start of a 10-year reign. Instead, it was a tombstone. Nick quit. He walked away from the supergroup he had helped build. He walked away from the fame, the money, and the spotlight. It was a move that baffled the industry. Who quits a band that is about to conquer the world? A man who wants to live. That's who. Nick retreated from the front of the stage back to the shadows, back to the role of the fixer, the producer, the writer. He found sanctuary in the recording studios of San Francisco, places like the newly built Wally Heider Studios. He became a chaotic element of sanity in an insane world. And it was in this capacity, as the steady hand in a shaking room, that he crossed paths with the tornado, Janis Joplin. The bond between Nick Gravenites and Janis Joplin lay beyond the feathers, the boas, and the Southern Comfort bottle. It was rooted in the scars. Janis was from Port Arthur, Texas, an oil refinery town that smelled of sulfur and small-mindedness. She had been bullied relentlessly in high school, called a pig, ostracized for being different, for liking art, for liking black music. She carried that trauma like a phantom limb. It never stopped hurting. Nick, the Greek boy from the ethnic ghetto of Chicago, the fatherless delinquent, recognized that pain instantly. They were both refugees. They were both white kids who had found salvation in the music of black sorrow. They were both loud, brash, and seemingly tough, using their badass personas to protect the fragile, wounded children hiding inside. When Nick met Janis, she was already a star, fronting Big Brother in the holding company. But Big Brother was messy. They were a raw, unpolished psychedelic band. They played with a chaotic energy that matched Janis's frantic stage presence, but they often lacked the musical discipline to truly support her voice. Janis was screaming against a wall of noise. She wanted more. She wanted the Chicago sound. She wanted horns. She wanted a beat that locked in. She wanted the kind of professional, soulful structure that Nick Gravenites carried in his DNA. When Janis left Big Brother to form the Cosmic Blues Band, she turned to Nick. She didn't just want him to write songs. She wanted him to help her build a new identity. She trusted him. In a world full of sycophants, hangers-on, and drug dealers who only wanted a piece of pearl, Nick was the big brother she never had. He was honest. He was unimpressed by her fame. He treated her like a musician, not a circus act. The work they did together was some of the most profound of the era. Nick wrote, "Work Me, Lord," for her. It wasn't a pop song, it was a secular hymn. It was a song about the burden of talent, the exhaustion of the road, and the desperate need for a higher power, whether that be God or a lover, to give meaning to the suffering. Watch the footage of Janis performing "Work Me, Lord" at Woodstock or on television. She isn't acting. She is bleeding. And the words she is bleeding are Nick's. "I've been working, but I ain't been loving, I ain't been loving, I ain't been loving." He gave her the language to articulate her loneliness. He understood that for people like them, the stage was the only place they felt truly alive, and yet the stage was the thing that was killing them. It was a paradox. You give everything to the audience, you empty your soul every night, and then you go back to a silent hotel room, alone with the ringing in your ears and the adrenaline souring in your blood. Nick tried to protect her. He saw the vultures circling. He saw the heroin use escalating. Janis used heroin differently than Bloomfield. For Bloomfield, it was a way to sleep. For Janis, it was a way to numb the pain of not being loved. It was a warm hug when there was no one else to hold her. Nick was there during the formation of the Cosmic Blues Band, trying to wrangle a group of musicians who were often more interested in the party than the practice. He was the anchor. He helped organize the chaos, but he could feel the tide rising. By 1969, the summer of love was a distant memory. The mood in America had darkened. The Vietnam War was raging. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy had been assassinated. The Manson family murders in Los Angeles had shattered the illusion of hippie innocence. The Altamont Free Concert, where a fan was stabbed to death by Hell's Angels while the Rolling Stones played, was the final nail in the coffin of the 1960s dream. San Francisco was no longer a playground. It was a skid row. Haight-Ashbury was filled with runaways, junkies, and predators. The hard drugs had taken over. Speed and heroin replaced marijuana and LSD. The paranoia was palpable. Nick Gravenites walked through this decaying landscape like a noir detective. He kept working, he kept writing. He was building a reputation as the go-to guy for anyone who needed a touch of that heavy, soulful blues authenticity. He produced the debut album for Quicksilver Messenger Service, trying to capture their shimmering guitar-heavy sound before the drugs dissolved their discipline. But his eyes were always on his friends, on Bloomfield, who was retreating further into his house in Mill Valley, surrounding himself with books and silence, avoiding the guitar that had made him famous, and on Janis, who was becoming bigger than life, a caricature of herself, Pearl, the woman with the feathers in her hair and the bottle in her hand, laughing too loud to hide the sound of her heart breaking. Nick knew they were in trouble. He wrote about it. His songs from this period are filled with images of death, of prisons, of being trapped. He wasn't writing fantasy. He was writing reportage. In late 1970, the call came for the new Janis Joplin album. She had formed a new band, the Full Tilt Boogie Band. They were tighter, more professional. She seemed happier. She told Nick she was clean, or at least cleaner. She wanted a song. Nick sat down and wrote "Buried Alive in the Blues." It's crucial to look at that title again. Buried Alive. It wasn't sad blues or lonely blues. It was a violent image. It was the image of someone struggling for breath, trapped under the weight of something they loved. It was about the music business. It was about the lifestyle. It was about the feeling of being consumed by the very thing that gave you life. The lyrics were jaunty, almost ironic. All caught up in a landslide, bad luck pressing in from all sides. Gotta keep on moving. It was a survivor's anthem. It was supposed to be Janis's declaration that she had made it through the storm. Nick brought the song to Los Angeles. The session was booked at Sunset Sound Recorders. The atmosphere was electric. The band loved the track. It had a driving, funky groove, a perfect vehicle for Janis's rhythmic singing style. They laid down the instrumental track on October 3rd. It smoked. It was perfect. Janis was there. She was excited. She was glowing. She told Nick, "I'm going to rip this one up tomorrow." Nick went back to his hotel. He probably slept well that night, thinking that maybe, just maybe, they had turned a corner. Maybe the darkness of the 60s was finally lifting. Maybe they were going to survive. But in the early hours of October 4th, 1970, in room 105 of the Landmark Motor Hotel, Janis Joplin walked to the lobby to buy a pack of cigarettes. She walked back to her room. She injected a dose of heroin that was significantly purer than what she was used to, and she fell. When the phone rang in Nick's room the next day, it wasn't a call to come to the studio. It was the call that every junkie's friend dreads, the call that ends the story. Nick went to the studio anyway. The band was there. The producers were there. The tape was there. The instrumental track of Buried Alive in the Blues was sitting on the reel, waiting for a voice that would never come. They played it back. The drums kicked in. The organ swirled. The guitar stung. And then silence. The space where Janis was supposed to be. For Nick, that silence wasn't empty. It was full of ghosts. It was the sound of Chicago, of San Francisco, of every late-night conversation, of every shared secret. It was the sound of the trap finally snapping shut. He had written the song for her to sing her way out of the grave. Instead, he had dug it for her. The funeral was over, but the mourning had only just begun. If the 1960s were a technicolor explosion, a decade that screamed in neon pinks and psychedelic purples, the early 1970s arrived like the gray static hum of a television channel that had gone off the air. The transition wasn't gradual. It was a violent, jarring cut to black. One moment, the youth of America believed they could levitate the Pentagon with their minds. The next, they were standing in the rain, cold, broke, and realizing that the revolution had been canceled due to lack of interest. Nick Gravenites stood in the wreckage of the counterculture, looking at a landscape that had been stripped of its illusions. The death of Janis Joplin in October 1970 wasn't just the loss of a friend. It was a structural failure in the architecture of the San Francisco scene. She was the load-bearing wall. When she collapsed, the roof came down on everyone. For Nick, the silence that followed the release of Pearl and the ghostly instrumental version of his song, Buried Alive in the Blues, was a physical weight. He carried it with him into the recording studios, into the bars, into the empty spaces where his friends used to be. But unlike so many others who crumbled under that weight, who retreated into madness or harder drugs, Nick did what he had always done. He went to work. This is the era of the hangover. We often romanticize the 1970s as the era of disco and stadium rock, of glittering excess and platform shoes. But the early part of the decade, the years between 1971 and 1974, was a grim, gritty period of survival. The optimism of the civil rights movement had curdled into the violence of the radical underground. The Vietnam War dragged on, a meat grinder that refused to stop turning. The economy began to wobble, and in the music world, the naive camaraderie of the early days was replaced by a cold corporate cynicism. The San Francisco sound, once a wild, unruly beast, had been tamed, packaged, and sold to the highest bidder. The suits had taken over. The ballrooms where the electric flag had once terrified audiences were now venues for polished, radio-friendly acts. The experimentation was over. The unit shifting had begun. Nick Gravenites found himself in a peculiar position. He was a founding father of a scene that no longer recognized him. He was too authentic for the pop charts, too gritty for the new soft rock radio formats, and too alive to be a martyr. He was a man out of time. He retreated from the city, moving north to Marin County. This was the great migration of the surviving hipsters. They traded their Haight-Ashbury apartments for houses in the redwoods, trading the noise of the street for the silence of the trees. But you cannot run away from your own shadow, especially when that shadow is cast by the ghosts of the dead. Marin County in the early 70s was a strange place. It was beautiful, misty, and quiet, but it was also a sanctuary for the wounded. It was where the casualties of the rock wars went to lick their wounds. You would see them at the local markets or driving down the winding coastal roads. Musicians who had played Woodstock now looking hollowed out, their eyes hiding behind dark glasses, trying to find a normalcy that didn't exist. Nick's work during this period reflects this shift. He wasn't trying to start a revolution anymore. He was trying to document the survival. He reunited with Mike Bloomfield, his old comrade in arms from the Chicago days. But the Mike Bloomfield he found in Mill Valley was not the firebrand of 1965. Bloomfield had become a recluse. The insomnia that had plagued him for years had evolved into a chronic, crushing anxiety. He lived behind drawn curtains, surrounded by books and records, a hermit in a house full of guitars he rarely played. The heroin was still there, a constant dulling companion, but now it was joined by a deep existential exhaustion. Nick became his lifeline. He was the only one who could pull Bloomfield out of the cave. They started playing together again, not for fame, but for therapy. They played small clubs, unannounced gigs where the audience would stare in disbelief at the two legends on stage, the hulking Greek singer with a voice like wet gravel, and the fragile Jewish guitarist who played like an angel falling from grace. The music they made in this period was different. It wasn't the aggressive, attacking blues of the Butterfield days. It was slower. It was sadder. It had a late-night, after-hours quality to it. It was the sound of two men sitting in a room, talking about the friends who hadn't made it. In 1969, just before the turn of the decade, Nick had released his solo album, My Labors. The title is crucial. Not my dreams, not my art, not my soul, my labors. To Nick, music was labor. It was work. It was something you did with your hands and your sweat. It was a craft, like carpentry or plumbing. You showed up, you did the job, you got paid, you went home. This blue-collar ethos was his armor against the narcissism that had destroyed Janis and was slowly destroying Mike. My Labors is a masterpiece of the survivor blues. It features Bloomfield on guitar, playing some of the most exquisite, painful solos of his career. The track Moon Tune or Gypsy Good Time aren't pop songs. They are atmospheric reports from the front lines of the psyche. They captured the feeling of the foggy San Francisco nights, the loneliness of the long drive home, the specific hollow ache of missing someone who is never coming back. But the industry didn't know what to do with Nick Gravenites. He didn't fit the mold. He wasn't a star. He didn't have the sexual charisma of a Jim Morrison or the dangerous allure of a Keith Richards. He looked like a longshoreman. He looked like the guy who fixed your car. In an era that was becoming increasingly obsessed with image, with glam rock and glitter, Nick was defiantly, stubbornly real. He refused to play the game. When record executives suggested he soften his sound or wear different clothes or write happier songs, he likely laughed in their faces. He had seen what the game did to people. He had seen it turn Janis into a caricature and Mike into a junkie. He wanted no part of it. He would rather play to 50 people who understood the music than to 50,000 who just wanted a show. This integrity came at a cost. It meant that while his peers were buying mansions and private jets, Nick was scraping by. It meant that he remained a musician's musician, a name whispered with reverence by the pros, but unknown to the public. It meant that he was destined to be the footnote, not the headline. But there is a certain freedom in being a footnote. You are harder to erase. As the 70s ground on, the casualties continued to mount. It wasn't just the famous ones. It was the bass players, the roadies, the lighting guys. The drug culture had permeated every level of the industry. Cocaine began to replace heroin as the drug of choice. If heroin was a warm blanket that put you to sleep, cocaine was a jagged wire that kept you awake. It made the music faster, brittle, more aggressive. It stripped away the swing and replaced it with a robotic, frantic energy. Nick hated it. He hated the coke vibe in the studios. He hated the endless, meaningless conversations, the egos inflated by white powder, the paranoia that turned bandmates into enemies. He missed the warmth of the blues. He missed the humanity of the mistake. He found himself drifting further away from the mainstream. He worked with the remnants of the old bands. He produced albums for bands that were trying to keep the flame alive, like Quicksilver Messenger Service, who were struggling to find their way in the new decade. He tried to help Big Brother and the holding company figure out who they were without Janis. He was the salvage expert, diving into the wrecks to see if there was anything worth saving. But the tragedy of the era was best personified by the slow, agonizing decline of Paul Butterfield. If Bloomfield was the fragile mystic, Butterfield had always been the rock, the tough guy, the street fighter. But the 70s broke him too. His addiction to heroin and alcohol was compounded by a horrific medical condition, peritonitis, that caused him constant, agonizing pain. He was literally rotting from the inside out. Nick watched his old friend, the man who had blown the harp with such ferocious power in the Chicago clubs, turn into a ghost. Butterfield's eyes, once sharp and dangerous, became dull and vacant. His playing lost its edge. He was dying by degrees, a public dismantling of a legend. There is a particular kind of horror in watching a strong man become weak. It is more terrifying than watching a weak man fail because it destroys the illusion of invincibility. Nick had looked up to Butterfield. He had been the leader, the general. Now the general was stumbling, and there was nothing the architect could do to prop him up. This sense of helplessness pervaded Nick's work in the mid-70s. He wrote songs about endurance, about holding on when your grip is slipping. He wasn't writing for the charts, he was writing for his life. He was writing to convince himself that survival was still possible. The San Francisco sound was dead. The Chicago sound was a memory. The industry had moved on to the slick, produced sounds of the Eagles and Fleetwood Mac. The blues was considered old-fashioned, a relic of a bygone era. The radio stations that had once played Born in Chicago were now playing Hotel California. Nick Gravenites stood on the shoreline of this new world, watching the tide go out. He was a man without a country. The Greece of his parents was a distant memory. The Chicago of his youth was a Rust Belt ruin. The San Francisco of his dreams was a corporate theme park. Where does a bluesman go when the blues go out of style? He goes deeper. Nick began to dig. He dug into the roots of the music, past the rock and roll, past the electric amps, back to the source. He realized that the blues wasn't a trend. It wasn't a fashion statement. It was the bedrock of human experience. As long as there was pain, as long as there was loss, as long as there was the need to wake up in the morning and face a world that didn't care if you lived or died, there would be the blues. He accepted his role. He wasn't going to be a star. He was going to be a keeper of the flame. He was going to be the guy who remembered how it was supposed to be done. In the quiet studios of Marin County, while the rest of the world was dancing to disco, Nick Gravenites kept recording. He kept writing. He kept playing the slow, sad shuffle of a man who has buried his friends and is waiting for the rain to stop. The phone would ring less often now. The big record deals dried up, the interviews stopped, but the music didn't. The music was the only thing that didn't leave him. And then, just as he was settling into this quiet, stoic existence, a new storm began to gather on the horizon. It wasn't a musical storm. It was a literal one. The 1980s were approaching, and they would bring a final brutal reckoning for the survivors of the 60s. The bills that had been deferred for a decade were about to be called in with interest. Mike Bloomfield was disappearing. He was no longer just a recluse. He was a phantom. Stories would filter back to Nick. Stories of Mike wandering the streets in his pajamas, of him being arrested, of him losing his mind. The twin soul, the other half of the equation, was fading out. Nick felt the cold wind of Chicago blowing through the redwoods of California. He knew, with the instinct of a man who had heard his father's warning about the gun, that something terrible was coming. The silence was about to be broken by one last, deafening crash. The 1990s brought a strange new weather system to the life of Nick Gravenites. It wasn't the storm of the 60s, nor the drought of the 70s, nor the cold fog of the 80s. It was a climate of artificial warmth. It was the era of nostalgia. The counterculture that Nick had helped build with blood and feedback had been sanitized, shrink-wrapped, and put on sale at the mall. The rebellion had become a brand. The Summer of Love was now a marketing slogan for soft drinks and compilation CDs. The terrifying drug-fueled chaos of Haight-Ashbury was being retold as a gentle fairy tale of peace and flowers. Nick Gravenites found himself living in a museum of his own life, where the tour guides were lying to the tourists. He was now in his 50s, a man of imposing physical presence, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, with a face carved from the same granite as the Chicago courthouse. He had survived the wars. He was the last man standing from the Chicago-San Francisco axis. Mike Bloomfield was dead. Paul Butterfield was dead. Janis Joplin was dead. Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, Keith Moon, all dead. And because he was alive, the world came to him with a specific demand. They wanted him to validate the myth. Documentarians, journalists, and rock historians began to seek him out. They wanted the survivor's perspective. But what they really wanted was a cozy anecdote. They wanted him to say, yes, we were young, we were wild, and it was beautiful. But Nick Gravenites didn't do cozy. He didn't do beautiful lies. He became the bad talker. This moniker was a badge of honor. In a world of PR-managed legends, Nick was the glitch in the matrix. When interviewers fished for stories about the spiritual expansion of the hate, Nick gave them the reality, the predators, the burnouts, and the stench of squats. He refused to canonize his friends. He loved Janis, Mike, and Paul too much to lie about them, insisting on remembering them as human beings, flawed, terrified, and destroyed by a machine they couldn't control. "I'm the guy," he would say with a dry chuckle, "who tells you that the emperor isn't just naked, he's also a junkie." This refusal to play along with the classic rock industrial complex cost him the glitzy award shows, but it bought him his dignity. While the industry counted money from box sets, Nick did what he had always done. He drove to the gig. He settled in Occidental, a quiet town of redwoods and fog north of San Francisco. Bad contracts from the 60s meant the architect rarely owned the building, so he worked. His office was the Saloon in North Beach, a wooden shack that survived the 1906 earthquake. It was a place where the blues was not a performance art, but a utility. Nick would haul his own gear onto the tiny stage. No roadies, no fanfare. He didn't play for stadiums. He played for bikers, tourists, and true believers. Watching him perform in this era was a masterclass in economy. He stood center stage, immovable as a mountain. His voice had deepened into a rich, resonant growl, containing all the ghosts of the past. When he sang Born in Chicago in 1998, it wasn't the shout of a punk anymore. It was the testimony of a judge passing sentence. He became a magnet for players who cared more about feel than fame, notably John Cipollina of Quicksilver Messenger Service. They were two battle-scarred veterans trading riffs, keeping the improvisational spirit of San Francisco alive long after the world moved on. But beneath the stoic exterior, Nick wrestled with survivor's guilt. Driving home alone on Highway 101 at 2 a.m., the question always returned. Why him? Why did he get to grow old while Mike Bloomfield was frozen forever at 37? Nick attributed it to his peasant blood, a low center of gravity inherited from Greek ancestors who survived famines and wars. "I don't have the luxury of being tragic," he once said. "I have work to do." This work ethic was his salvation, but it couldn't protect him from the pain of erasure. As rock history was codified into documentaries, Nick was often the Zelig of the blues, always in the picture, but rarely identified. It is a specific kind of ego death to see Born in Chicago listed as a Paul Butterfield classic, or Buried Alive in the Blues, celebrated as Janis's final statement, while the man who wrote the words is still paying the electric bill. Yet, Nick never let bitterness stop the music. He channeled that frustration into legendary stage banter, using humor to deflate the industry's pretension. He made fun of the hippies, the rock stars, and himself. By refusing to be a star, he inadvertently became a cult hero, the keeper of the hard truth in a world of beautiful lies. A new generation of listeners, the record collectors, and the music nerds began to discover him. They read the liner notes. They connected the dots. They realized that this guy, this Nick Gravenites, was the common denominator in all their favorite albums. They started showing up at the saloon. They brought him old vinyl to sign. They treated him not as a relic, but as a sage. Nick accepted this late blooming appreciation with a shrug. He was suspicious of adulation. He had seen adulation kill his best friends. He preferred respect, and respect is what he got. In 2003, the blues community finally gave him his due in a formal way. He was inducted into the Blues Hall of Fame for Born in Chicago. It wasn't the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, that corporate fortress in Cleveland that had ignored him, but it meant more. It was recognition from his peers, from the lineage of the music he loved. But even as he accepted the plaque, he probably thought about the irony. He was being honored for a song he wrote about a city he left 40 years ago. He was being honored for a past that he had spent decades trying to escape. The 2000s moved forward, and the world grew even stranger. The digital revolution decimated the record industry. The studios where Nick had learned his craft were closing down, replaced by laptops in bedrooms. The album as an art form was dying. Yet Nick Gravenites remained. He was like a lighthouse on a rocky coast. The ships had changed from wooden schooners to steel tankers and then to digital ghosts, but the light had to keep turning. He faced health scares, the inevitable breakdown of the body that comes with age. But unlike his friends who had abused their bodies with needles and bottles, Nick's ailments were just the rust of a long life. He dealt with them. He had surgeries. He recovered. He got back on stage. There is a profound heroism in this mundane endurance. It is easy to be a shooting star. Gravity does the work for you. It is hard to be a planet, spinning in orbit year after year, holding your course. As he entered his 70s, Nick began to look back with a clearer eye. He started working on his autobiography. He wanted to set the record straight. He wanted to write the history of the Chicago White Boys from the inside. before the last witness was gone. He realized that his shadow status was actually his greatest asset. Because he hadn't been the front man, because he hadn't been the sex symbol, he had been allowed to be a human being. He had a family. He had a home. He had a life that wasn't consumed by the voracious appetite of the public. He looked at the empty spaces where Mike and Paul and Janis should have been. They should have been there, getting old with him. They should have been complaining about their backs and arguing about politics. They should have been bad talkers together. But they were forever young, forever beautiful, and forever silent. So Nick spoke for them, but he didn't speak the words the world wanted to hear. He spoke the words they would have said if they had lived long enough to regret the party. He would finish a set at the saloon, sweat dripping down his face, the feedback of the guitar fading into the hum of the refrigerator. He would pack his guitar into the case, not a roadie, but him. He would walk out into the cool San Francisco night, the city that was now owned by tech billionaires and software engineers. He would get in his car and drive north, crossing that fog-swept span one last time, not with the fire and ambition of 1967, but as a grandfather, a survivor, and a keeper of the flame. He wasn't buried alive in the blues. He had dug his way out to build a house on top of the graveyard. And as the bridge faded into the rearview mirror, leaving behind the psychedelic mist of the past, Nick Gravenites drove toward the white, blinding light of his final act. Nick Gravenites had entered the coda. In musical theory, the coda is the passage that brings a piece to an end. It is technically an expansion, a way of looking back at the themes that have come before and resolving them into a final resting chord. For Nick, this coda would last for nearly a decade and a half. It was a time of physical fragility, yes, but of immense spiritual clarity. He had outlived the noise. He had outlived the fury. Now he was living in the echo. By the 2000s, Nick had settled into the quiet, redwood-shaded community of Occidental, and later Santa Rosa. He was no longer the imposing, bear-like figure who had terrified club owners in Chicago. Age had chiseled him down. He moved slower. The arthritis in his hands, the hands that had held the first electric guitars of the blues revolution, was a constant nagging companion. But the eyes remained the same, dark, heavy-lidded, and filled with a terrifyingly sharp intelligence. He was the last lion in a zoo that had been closed down. The world outside his window had changed beyond recognition. The gritty music industry he helped build had dissolved into the digital ether, leaving the physical era of vinyl and tape behind. The blues, once the dangerous, subversive language of the underclass, had been gentrified. It was now the soundtrack for expensive whiskey commercials and dad rock cover bands. But Nick refused to be a relic. He refused to be a museum exhibit. Even as his body began to betray him, his mind continued to work the problem. He was still the architect, and he had one final structure to build, his own legacy. He knew that if he didn't tell the story, someone else would, and they would get it wrong. They would make it too pretty. They would airbrush out the scars. So he began to write, not songs this time, but prose. He sat down to write his memoirs, appropriately titled Bad Talkin' Blues. The process of writing was an act of exorcism. He had to summon the ghost one last time. He had to sit in his room and invite Mike Bloomfield back from the dead. He had to look Paul Butterfield in the eye again. He had to hear Janis's laugh echoing off the walls. He wrote with the same blunt, unadorned honesty that had defined his lyrics. He didn't write to be liked. He wrote to be true. He described the Chicago of the 1950s not as a nostalgic wonderland, but as a hard, cold place where survival was a daily coin toss. He described the San Francisco of the 60s not as a utopia, but as an asylum run by the inmates. He settled scores. He corrected the record. He reclaimed his place in the narrative not out of ego, but out of a desire for accuracy. He was the witness who refused to be cross-examined by history. But he didn't just write, he played. Until the very end, Nick Gravenites kept the music alive. In 2024, the very year of his death, he released a new album titled Rogue Blues. The title itself was a final act of defiance, a rogue, an outlier, an elephant that has left the herd. The album was produced by his longtime collaborator Pete Sears, another veteran of the Jefferson Starship era who understood Nick's language. Listen to the voice on that final record. It is not the voice of a young man. It is a voice that has been cured in smoke and sorrow for 85 years. It cracks. It wheezes. It rumbles like tectonic plates shifting deep underground. But the timing, the impeccable, swinging, lazy timing of the Chicago Shuffle is perfect. He was singing from a wheelchair. He was living in an assisted living facility. But when the red light of the recording console went on, he was back in the 708 Club, he was back at the Fillmore, he was back in the pocket. There is a profound beauty in this refusal to stop. Most people retire, they play golf, they watch television. Nick Gravenites played the blues. He understood, perhaps more than anyone, that the blues isn't something you do, it's something you are. You don't stop being the blues just because your legs don't work. You don't stop being the blues just because your friends are dead. You play until the silence takes you. And the silence was coming. In the late summer of 2024, the news began to filter through the tight-knit community of musicians in the Bay Area. Nick was fading. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. It wasn't a drug overdose in a hotel room. It wasn't a car crash. It was the slow, natural, and inevitable winding down of a clock that had been ticking since 1938. He was surrounded by family. He was surrounded by love. This is the crucial contrast, the final victory of Nick Gravenites over the tragic destiny of his generation. Mike Bloomfield died alone in a locked car, unrecognized and unclaimed for hours. Janis Joplin died alone on a floor, reaching for a pack of cigarettes. Paul Butterfield died alone in an apartment destroyed by pain. Nick Gravenites did not die alone. He had beaten the curse. He had proven that you could touch the fire and not be consumed. He had proven that the rock and roll lifestyle didn't have to be a death sentence. He had found a way to be a human being first and a legend second. On September 18, 2024, in Santa Rosa, California, the architect laid down his tools. The heart that had beaten the rhythm for a revolution finally stopped. He was 85 years old. The news of his death did not break the internet. It didn't stop the news cycle. There were no breaking news alerts on CNN. But across the world, among the people who knew, the musicians, the historians, the lovers of the deep cuts, there was a collective exhalation, a feeling that a mighty oak had finally fallen in the forest. The tributes began to pour in, but they were different from the usual celebrity platitudes. They were reverent. They were grateful. People posted the lyrics to Born in Chicago. They posted the instrumental track of Buried Alive in the Blues. They realized, perhaps for the first time, just how much of the music they loved belonged to this one quiet man. They realized that without Nick, there is no Paul Butterfield Blues Band. Without Nick, Janis Joplin's Cosmic Blues sounds different. Without Nick, the bridge between the muddy roots of the Delta and the psychedelic branches of the West Coast would never have been built. He was the mortar between the bricks. And now that the mortar was gone, we could finally see the structure for what it was. So how do we measure the life of Nick Gravenites? Do we measure it in gold records? He didn't have many. Do we measure it in fame? He could walk down the street in most cities unrecognized. Do we measure it in money? He died a working man, not a tycoon. No, we measure it in weight. Nick Gravenites provided the gravity for a generation that was in danger of floating away. When the hippies were drifting into space, he pulled them back to Earth with a Chicago bass line. When the guitar heroes were getting lost in their own solos, he grounded them with a song structure that was as solid as concrete. When the stars were burning out, he was the one who kept the lights on. He was the designated survivor. But he was more than that. He was the designated truth teller. In the final analysis, his life is a testament to the power of the side man. We live in a culture that worships the front man, the face on the poster. But the front man is often just a projection of our own desires. The side man is the reality. The side man is the one who does the work. Nick Gravenites was the ultimate side man to history. He stood just outside the spotlight, in the shadows, where the real work gets done. He saw the wires. He saw the trapdoors. He saw the machinery of fame for the meat grinder it was. And he made a conscious choice to step back. He chose life. It is a choice that requires a different kind of courage than the courage of the martyr. It requires the courage to be ordinary, the courage to grow old, the courage to be forgotten by the masses so that you can be remembered by the people who matter. As we look back on his 85 years, we see a life that spanned the entire arc of modern American music. He was there when the blues was still a secret language spoken in the Southside clubs. He was there when it exploded into the mainstream. He was there when it was co-opted by rock and roll. He was there when it died, and he was there when it was reborn. He was the thread that stitched it all together, and now the thread is cut, but the tapestry remains. The story of Nick Gravenites is not a tragedy. It is a triumph disguised as a footnote. In a world that demands we burn bright and fade fast, he dared to smolder. He dared to endure. He was the Greek chorus in the tragedy of American rock, the voice that stood on the side of the stage and told us what it all meant. He wrote the anthem for his city, born in Chicago, and in doing so, he gave a voice to every white kid who felt the blues but didn't know if they were allowed to sing it. He wrote the epitaph for his friend, buried alive in the blues, and in doing so, he captured the beautiful, terrible paradox of an art form that feeds on the suffering of its creators. He buried his friends. He buried his heroes. He buried the era that made him, but he never buried the music. The irony of his most famous song title is that Nick Gravenites was never buried alive. He was the only one who managed to dig himself out. He climbed out of the grave of the 1960s, shook the dirt off his boots, and walked for another 50 years. He leaves behind a silence, yes, but it is not an empty silence. It is the silence of a job well done. It is the silence of a studio after the master take has been recorded. The red light is off. The faders are down. The architect has left the building. But if you listen closely in the static between the stations, in the hum of the amplifier before the first note is struck, you can still hear him. He is there in the shadow, nodding his head, tapping his foot, and reminding us of the one truth he held on to for 85 years. The singer dies. The song lives.